Welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk featuring Ellen Carroll DuBois discussing her book, Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote. I'm Jessica VanLanduyt, Vice President of Guest Experiences for the Atlanta History Center and curator of the exhibition, Any Great Change, the Centennial of the 19th Amendment. Tonight's program is a complement to the exhibition, which is made possible through the generosity of Emily Bourne Grigsby. You can purchase copies of Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote from Acapella Books at the link in the chat to the right of your screen, and also at the link provided on the History Center's website. As Ellen and I are talking, you'll be able to submit questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll get to as many of them as we can as time allows. Let me introduce our guest this evening. Ellen Carroll DuBois is Distinguished Research Professor at UCLA, where she taught women's history. She's the co-editor of the anthology Unequal Sisters, a multicultural reader in women's history, and co-author of Through Women's Eyes, An American History with Documents, both of which gone through multiple editions. In 1998, she won the Joan Kelly Memorial Prize at the American Historical Association for her book, Harriet Stanton Blatch and the Winning of Women's Suffrage. Welcome, Ellen. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So let's get started. We are here at the Centennial, and we've had a lot to commemorate and discuss in an election year. So kind of talk to me about what you've been doing recently to commemorate and to consider the centennial of the 19th Amendment.
Well, mostly what I've been doing is talking to people like you about my book. I've been writing sort of op-ed articles. That was very exciting. I wrote them for the Wall Street Journal and for the New York Daily News and for the Los Angeles Times, where I was able to write about suffrage history from a local perspective. One of the wonderful things about the suffrage movement is it was so national and not just broadly national, but deeply national, that there's sort of no place in the United States where you cannot find a local side of this story. So I think that helps to celebrate, to build the celebration of the centennial around.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I had, having loved the suffrage movement for so long and read on it in a variety of ways, this is, I feel like for kind of the understanding of what I kind of call the alphabet soup of all of the organizations, right, and how they're working and the strategies in which they're working and the breakups and the divorces and the coming back together and the changes over the generations. This book, I really enjoyed it, and boy, it kind of blew me away in a couple of ways. There are things that I learned that I think I didn't realize were so kind of important. Let's talk about the very first thing. You start in Seneca Falls. You start with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and the Women's Rights Convention. These women have been abolitionists. They've been speaking as anti-slavery warriors, and they come together to finally, after having been kept out of anti-slavery meetings, they say, we're going to kind of get together and talk about it. We're going to come up with a plan. We're going to declare women's rights. And this is the beginning of your book. It's the beginning of what we consider the women's suffrage movement. And suffrage isn't even really a big part of the discussion, right? They're discussing equal rights for women in a variety of ways around marriage and around property. And suffrage kind of is coming in the last minute by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Can you talk about that?
I wouldn't say it's coming in at the last minute. She was very clear in understanding that suffrage was the queen pin of the whole thing. But she need to convince the other people at this convention, the several hundred people who attended. It was a period like, not so much now, but periods that I've lived through, where there was so much sense of the corruption of politics that it seemed like when I was a youth, when I was in the 60s, it was very common for people who were very radical to refuse to vote because they felt there was no difference between the two parties, and and that was sort of the period that Seneca Falls appeared, the Seneca Falls Convention. But it was Stanton's conviction. I think I now understand because of the work of one of my students, Linda Frank, that she really became convinced about the fundamentally political nature of social change from her husband. And this is also a period a year in which two important things are happening to give context to the Seneca Falls Convention and Stanton's determination to put suffrage. First of all, there are revolutions all over Europe of countries that have no democratic franchise, although many Black men and all women couldn't vote in this country. The case that the United States had the most broad-based franchise of any country in the world. So there were revolutions all over Europe. And then perhaps what was happening at Seneca Falls was a kind of American version of the revolutions of 1848, this time in the name of women. The other thing that was happening is that there were major upheavals in American politics following the end of the Mexican-American War, which sort of broke open a consensus of the two parties that nobody would talk about slavery at the national level, and that collapsed. And from that point on, slavery is impossible to keep out of national politics. And so for people who were deeply abolitionists, it became increasingly clear that they had to get into politics, into electoral politics. So for women, this was a dilemma because so long as abolition was considered a fundamentally kind of moral movement, women could play a major role. But once it became more and more political, the fact that women were excluded from the franchise stood out. And so we can see at this point, I mean, getting the right to vote was in large part because Stanton believed that this was the only way to advance women's equality and to win all of the other aspects of women's rights. But it was also the case for this generation, and I would say for all the subsequent generations, that they were determined to be part of history-changing events. They did not want to be on the margins. And at this point, slavery is moving into electoral politics, and Stanton and the women like her want to be part of that.
Mm-hmm. So it's the power of the vote, and that is, you know, as you see the suffragists align themselves in various ways or different causes aligning with suffrage, because ultimately it's the means to the end, right? It's that political equality, it's social equality, it's you know, throughout the movement, you see, you know, the labor unions or temperance, you see them kind of coming in and aligning at times with suffrage movement and kind of taking up that cause. So these kind of dual things are happening, right?
Right. So it's suffrage is often, women's suffrage is often posed as a kind of single issue movement. And in the last few years, when they were really pressing strategically, especially in Congress and with the president, there was a very insistent focus on suffrage and suffrage alone. But it was never the case for suffragists that all they cared about was women's right to vote. Virtually every one of them had other convictions that they wanted the vote to be useful for, from abolition to temperance to labor reform to peace to birth control.
Right. Right. And that, I think, you know, demonstrates, you know, as you consider even the people who are advocating for the vote, who know by 1920 that they might not have the ability to exercise the vote, whether it's in the South due to political barriers of the Jim Crow laws or having to do with citizenship or any other kind of barrier that comes up. You still see people showing up because that's the power of what we've, you know, that democracy, right? The power of the voice and the ability to get things done at that political level. And I think that's what's so surprising in the book is how closely politics, right? I mean, they are right there.
Right.
Moving along party lines and party planks and party, movements, whether it's, in the North or South or out West, everybody's kind of aligning based on how politics are in that region.
Exactly.
Yeah. So can you talk about, I've got my notes here. So can you talk about a little bit, speaking of that kind of political alignment, and one thing that comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, and it has power and doesn't throughout the movement, is the Southern strategy. And you used Henry Blackwell, although it's kind of Laura Clay and Kate Gordon, to employ this in the South. You actually talk about Blackwell's words, where he said, the Southern strategy, this idea that 4 million Southern white women will counterbalance your 4 millions of Negro men and women, and thus the political supremacy of your white race will remain unchanged. Yes.
Again, I feel like we need to put this in context, but I will point out that it is especially the case in the final years when, on the one hand, Black women are increasingly well organized, and on the other hand, Southern states like your own beloved Georgia had worked very hard to get Black men out of the franchise, and they recognized that disfranchising Black women would be harder than disfranchising Black men, for a variety of reasons, one of which was that claims about Black men being sexual predators was one of the weapons that were used to disfranchise Black men, and you couldn't do that about Black women. So there are, as you point out, from the beginning, there are white suffragists who, mostly Southern white suffragists, who are Southern white, did I say white? Yes, Southern white suffragists who are using this kind of argument. It's sometimes said to be a kind of mild form of voter suppression. So instead of violence against Black men or threats at the polls, the argument that they made was that you needn't worry. There are more white women than there are Black women. Enfranchising all women, you don't have to keep Black women out of the polls. Enfranchising all women will increase the percentage of white voters and therefore reinforce white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. I think
it's not a very happy part of the story, but it is a part of the story.
Right. No, and I think that's, we say at the History Center a lot, history is messy. And I think that's part of what we, as we look back and we try to understand who we are and how we're made as a country, where we've been and where we're going, that this is certainly, kind of a common theme of, it comes and goes in a variety of ways. I've got a question from Diane that's really good, just based on what we were talking about. She asked, can you talk about the other issues of the suffragist and how the white organizations and the African-American activist goals were the same and how different?
Just trying to see who Diane was. I have a Diane. Okay, go ahead. Ask the question again.
Okay, can you talk about the other issues of the suffragist and how the white organizations and the African-American activist goals were the same and how are they different?
Very good, very good. Well, it is certainly the case that African-American suffragists, on the one hand, understood the role of the right to vote to improve the conditions of their lives, of their families' lives, of their children's lives, and of their own conditions. From the very beginning, some of the more famous suffragists, Black suffragists, explained that they couldn't keep control of their own property because their taxes were too high and they had no votes to counter that. So on the one hand, they wanted suffrage for those kinds of reasons, which were the same as white women. On the other hand, Black women, precisely because they are coming close to getting the vote at a time when Black men have been driven out of the franchise, they understand that they have a responsibility for what they call the race. And so they want the right to vote because they feel that they can protect Black interests. Now that Black men have basically lost the right to vote, and also because they thought Black men hadn't done a very good job in using their votes well and in and protecting their votes. So they did see their right to vote as something that they didn't, unlike white women, I would say, they didn't particularly see themselves as needing the vote to protect themselves against men, but of advancing their own interests and that of their community.
Okay. Thank you, Diane, for that question. That's one of the things that, when you think about a movement such as this and the long arc of this movement, right? It begins, in the 1840s, we come to the 1920s, and then we continue. The women's movement continues as we look towards the Equal Rights Amendment, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the generational differences that are coming up, the ways in which we are activists, the ways in which we approach as women, particularly the kind of perception of the ways in which women did this were tied often to the gender, talking about women being emotional, or women should not assert themselves in a particular way, or women outside of the kind of normal sphere. And then you see women who are kind of embracing the idea of that, who are wearing, pants, or who are showing up and protesting in front of the White House. Can you talk about just kind of the larger generational shifts in the way that people went about the suffrage fight?
Let's stay within 75 years of the suffrage movement for starters.
Fair enough.
There is at least 3 generations of women who fight for the right to vote between 1848 and 1920. At the beginning of this story, women are, like visually, we can see them. They're wearing burdensome clothes. They're wearing hoop skirts, and they cannot go to college. They have no control, if married, of their own wages or even their own children. And they have virtually no access to any occupations or trades except teaching, for which they were underpaid, and making clothes and making cloth and making shoes, what were called the garment trade. The needle trades. By the 19-teens, and so at that point, at the beginning, the right to vote represents a whole range of things that women are not allowed to do, and of equality that they are prohibited from having, that they can't even imagine. Now, if we go ahead to the 1910s, things have changed a great deal. Women are actually the majority of college graduates. They are a quarter of the labor force. They have a big impact on professions like particularly medicine and law. They are winning Pulitzer Prizes and Nobel Prizes. They are major figures in the world, in the nation and in the world. And so at that point, the fact that they can't have the right to vote is a kind of terrible backward element of otherwise a generation that is, and they look like us. They have short hair, and the length of their skirts are going up. They're modern women. They drive cars. They use the telephone. They are much more like us than the first generation. Now, if we go all the way up to the ERA battle, I guess I would say a couple of things. These are women who, unlike any of the people in the suffrage story, actually have the right to vote. And so women are active politically on both sides of the ERA movement and very organized. It is really a battle, a political battle between women. And it's a battle that takes place inside. What's that? It's a battle that takes place inside the political parties. This battle over the ERA changes the Republican Party fundamentally, and the Democratic Party for that matter. When the battle starts, many of your listeners may know that the ERA was before Congress since the 1920s. And through the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, it was the Republican Party that was the party that supported the ERA to any degree, and the Democratic Party opposed it. Then in the late 60s and early 70s, that switched, and we get a Republican Party that uses issues of inequality between women or women's special sphere as a social, as a cutting edge issue, an issue that divides people, whereas the Democratic Party, of course, becomes the party that women are voting for in larger numbers and greater percentages than men. I would say, though, that there's a similarity here, which is that when women are in politics, especially when they're trying to get into office, stereotypes about women seem almost unchanged from generations before. Women are, and there's always a double bind. Women are either too soft or too hard. If they are forceful, they are mannish and aggressive. If they are kind and sweet, they don't belong in politics. They don't have the capacity for it. And always, there are nasty things that can be said about women sexually if they're trying to get into politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the tension that creates now, but you're looking at, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the tension that it causes in between, people who believe you should speak out in a particular way, and we don't care if we look, if we are picketing the White House, that's what we're meant to do in this way. And then but you're going to set us back if you continue to be so brash and out there that those stereotypes can be used against you. How does that tension kind of play out as the torch is passing from generation to generation?
You mean in the final period?
Yes.
What you mean? Well, there are two wings of the suffrage movement in the last decade. One you could call one the inside wing and one the outside wing. The wing that most people know about is the outside wing. They engage in civil disobedience. They're the first major reform movement to picket the White House. They follow the lead of their British sisters, who were called initially, to embarrass them, suffragettes. And they follow their lead. They're arrested, they're thrown in jail. Some of them are force-fed, and they insist that they're political prisoners. And they eventually win that battle of insisting that they're political prisoners. Then there's actually a much larger group that play an inside game, and they are lobbyists. Now, at this point, it's already the case lobbying has a bad name. So these women call themselves, they don't go in the back door, they're the front door lobby, as they say. And they work relentlessly and brilliantly. I must say, one of the things I learned from writing this book is, if anything, I was more impressed by by the picketers. These lobbyists work for years, for half a decade, to get first the bills passed through the House and the Senate that initiate the ratification campaign, and then the ratification campaign in 1919 and 1920. They have lists of, first of all, they keep brilliant lists of all of the congressmen. They have index cards in which they write everything that can possibly be known about the congressman. You know, whether he has sort of a bad reputation, whether his daughter is pro-suffrage, all the kinds of things that they need to know before they go in the door. And then they also have a list of a set of rules that they follow, which I think we would be well to follow now. You must always knock on the door of a congressman because you never know what's going on the other side. You must, right, you must befriend the secretary. If and when the congressman or the senator refuses to give in to your arguments, you must never lose your temper. You must thank him and leave so that you do not, as they said, close the door to the next person. And finally, when you're done, you should go into the ladies' room and write down all your notes for the next person. There was something I wanted to say about, oh yes, the chief lobbyist tells a really interesting story. I think it's in the book. Her name is Maud Wood Park, and she's really in charge of the whole lobbying campaign in Congress. And she's dealing with a congressman about a constant delay and of plans to bring the bill for suffrage ratification up, postponement. And she finally, at one point she says, I think it's actually early in the struggle, she says, she breaks it, she can't help herself. She just collapses into tears. She's completely embarrassed because that's the thing you're not supposed to do. I think every one of us women knows the fear of crying when you're in a professional environment or some other place where shedding a tear. You remember what happened to Hillary when she just got a tad emotional? And so she cries. And at that point, the congressman sort of pats her on the shoulder and says, there. Turns out you're just a woman after all. And from then on, he's a friend of suffrage. So she learned the very complex algorithms of strength and weakness that women played to get this bill through.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate the idea of the front door lobbying. And it almost sounds like they're kind of pioneers in a way, right? In the way that they went about this kind of advocacy.
Well, as I said, people had done lobbying before, but they weren't a citizens' lobby, and they weren't a reform movement's lobby. They were, they were corporate forces, political forces. So these were women who were not trying to trade anything for votes. They just wanted to convince congressmen to support their goal. Right.
I love that. And I think one of the things we think about with politics and, throughout this book, how much the discussion of the party lines, right? The Democrats and Republicans and how closely tied they were. And there's this regionality to it. And then there's also what's happening out west with states, forming and the power of women's vote there. Can you talk a little bit about just, you kind of go into detail around, California and New York, and the importance of those kinds of big things. What would be kind of the maybe turning point of the suffrage movement? Is there one kind of thing?
Well, I think maybe what you're referring to is an aspect of the movement that's not much appreciated, which is the nature of the Constitution is such, we often call it federalism, in which there's a distribution of power or coexistence of power at the state level and at the federal level. You know, if we look at the abortion rights movement, we watch how when either actually the pro or the anti-abortion side is closed off at a state level, they'll move to the federal level. And if they're closed off at the federal level, they're moved to the state level. Well, the same was true of suffrage. In fact, the US Constitution, nothing could be more important than this. The US Constitution really, from the beginning, left the power of the vote to the states. There was one point early on in the suffrage movement in the Reconstruction years when suffragists tried to link the right to vote with a larger transformation of voting from something that the states controlled to something that was linked to national citizenship. They failed. Mm-hmm. We would live in a very different world. Our beloved Stacey Abrams would have to find something else to do with herself than trying to defend to fight against voter suppression, because it's based in the fact that the states still control the right to vote. Having said that, after the battle over the 15th Amendment, as Elizabeth Stanton says, the constitutional door slammed shut. And there was no federal constitutional amendment between the 15th Amendment in 1870 and the 16th Amendment in the 1910s. In those 40 years, the suffragists switch from the federal side to the state side, and they go into separate states and work to convince male voters to amend their state constitutions to give women the right to vote. When they are successful and state constitutions are amended, the women who get the right to vote have full voting rights. They vote all the way up to president. The first state where that happens is Wyoming in 1890, then Colorado in 1893. The sixth state is California in 1911. By about 1914, the number of women who have these full voting rights, who are able to vote for president as well as their state officers, numbers something like 4 million. It's about 14% of the female population. Now, you probably noticed when I said Wyoming and Colorado and California, all of those states are Western states, west of the Mississippi. Why is that? That's a long discussion, but I think the general explanation is that the major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are a little weaker in the Western states. And the two third-party movements that surface in these years, first the Populist Party of the 1890s and then the Progressive Party of the 1910s. And these are the two political insurgencies that bring women's suffrage to victory in all of these states. They're all really located, for the most part, in the Western states. Finally, in 1917, this effort to bring suffrage to women by changing state constitutions crosses the Mississippi and succeeds in the most populous and powerful state with the greatest number of Congress people in the Union, and that's New York at the time. And when that happens in November of 1917, little asterisk here. When I wrote the book, you know, one of the things about historians is whenever you're writing, things come to you that wouldn't come to you if you were writing in another time. In other words, when you write history, it's a dialogue between where you stand in the present and the past. Well, when I wrote this book, I didn't pay any attention to this thing called the 1918 flu epidemic. Who knew about that? And then who cared? And then as soon as my book was published, that came into the forefront. So anyhow, in the election of November of 1917, the flu epidemic is beginning to descend in on the United States. New York, the male voters of New York, and also, of course, not just the flu epidemic. There's this thing called the war. The male voters of New York vote to amend their constitution, and once that happens, in some ways, the battle must be won from that point on. 2 months after that, that's November, in January of 1918, the House, which had entertained a bill to start the ratification process before, passes it without a vote to spare. And at that point, we are moving more and more, moving into the various stages of the ratification campaign. It takes a surprising long time. Both the flu epidemic and the war create a kind of a break, but it takes it takes from January of 1918 to June of 1919 for the second house, the Senate, 2/3 of those members to pass the bill. And then it takes another 15 months. By this time, the war is over and the flu is pretty much over. But ratification is a very high mountain to climb. And this brings us, of course, once again to the South and to Georgia. So one of the reasons you need a federal amendment is that it would never be the case that all states would amend their constitutions. And Southern states, former Confederate states, would never do so, because to do that would be to open the franchise door, as I mentioned before, to Black women. They would not allow that. So the only way that women in the South, white and Black, are going to get the right to vote is by a federal amendment. But it's also the case that those very same states are going to resist ratifying. And so as we need 36 states. There's a reason why there are only, 27, 28 amendments to the Constitution in 200 years. There's a reason. It's tough. And to get those final last 1 or 2 states took a long time. And very interestingly, the final state was a border Southern state, and it was Tennessee.
Yeah.
Tell the Tennessee story?
The Tennessee story is great. Yeah, I will say before that Georgia has this really unique relationship with the 19th Amendment. It's the only Southern supporter to vote for in the Senate is William J. Harris of Georgia. But then we become the first state to reject ratification right out of the gate. We're there, and we'll finally ratify in 1970.
Yeah, it's amazing. Mississippi, not until 1971. I mean, of course, the last 12 states or the last 14 states don't have to ratify. It's ratified in part of the Constitution. But I guess Georgia continued to fight against wide voting rights all the way through, and also fight for wide voting rights, I must say. So the Tennessee story. So the Tennessee story is that, unlike most Southern states in these years, it is a two-party state. There's a residual Republican Party in the eastern part of Tennessee, in the mountainous part of Tennessee. And it is the fact that there is both a Republican and a Democratic Party there that really makes the difference, because the parties are really going to fight each other both for and against suffrage. In the end, this comes down to a very, very hot, just like now, August 1920, exactly 100 years ago. And in the end, the final vote in the Tennessee legislature was cast by a 24-year-old first-term legislator from the eastern part of Tennessee, a man named Harry Byrne, who was very handsome, which is irrelevant, but he was. And the story, and it's true, is that he got a letter from his mother telling him to vote in favor of, as she said, Mrs. Catt's rat, meaning ratification. He not only did what his mother told him, but even after other members of his party put tremendous pressure on him, he stayed the course. And it was his vote that is memorialized as what provided the 36th state.
Yeah, that's a great story. And through your book, I didn't realize just how much pressure was placed on him. He really had to be steadfast for several days. We think of, the 18th and it just happened, and there were quite a few challenges. We were on the brink of losing it.
That's why I've sort of objected to everybody saying, oh, August 18th is the date. It's not. It was really not. That's when Tennessee makes this vote. But there are many efforts to try to undo that vote. And it is really not until the governor signs the bill and it is brought to the desk of the Secretary of State of the United States in the morning of the 26th, and he accepts it, that it enters the Constitution. Until then, it could have been undone in a million devious ways.
Yeah.
Not the 18th, the 26th.
And we've got this whole week. We're commemorating and talking about this up to the 26th.
Good.
Questions from folks who are attending this evening. If you could meet one suffragette, who would that be and why?
All right. So first of all, Jessica, let's let people know the term suffragette is not the right term.
That's actually the second question, is why was suffragette considered an insult? Sounds like a regular word to me. Talk about that.
All right. Well, it's, we no longer talk about the women who, remember in the old days when we used to fly on an airplane? Remember that? And in my youth, we used to call the people who buckled us in and brought us our drinks and checked to see if we were all right, we called them stewardesses. There were times when Emily Dickinson was called a poetess. She wasn't a poet, she was a poetess. We no longer talk about stewardesses. We talk about flight attendants. We don't use terms that distinguish between men and women doing the same job in a way which diminishes women. So the suffragette is the same kind of word. It takes the word and adds a diminishing suffix to it, suffragette. And it was originally used by British newspapers to make fun of suffrage advocates. Now, like many smart social justice fighters, when a nasty word is thrown at them, I have a T-shirt that says, "I'm a nasty woman," okay? Queer was originally a negative word. Now it's a word of pride. So what happened is suffrage activists of a certain wing, among the more radical wing, took the term suffragette and embraced it to remove it of its, to deprive it of its negative inflection. Nonetheless, there was a distinction between the larger, what I call the inside, people playing an inside game who call themselves suffragists, and the smaller group playing the outside game, and they were suffragettes. Okay, now let's go back to the original question. Which suffragist would I? Well, that's an easy question. From the very beginning of the work that I've been doing on this subject when I was 21 years old, it's always been Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I just think she had a great mind. She was, she's getting a lot of very bad press these days for the racism, which is part of her legacy. but it's not the entirety of her legacy. Not only is she the person who first introduces women's suffrage, but she has an incredibly broad sense and very modern sense of what women need for true freedom. In addition to the right to vote, the two others that I think are particularly important, she's a very early proponent of marriage and sexual and reproductive freedom for women. She called it self-sovereignty, the right to control your own body. And she's also, at the end of her life, in the last 20 or 30 years, she had in her sort of lifelong search to try to figure out what the root causes of women's subordination were. She concluded that they were religion. And in this period, most of the powers that be in this period are Protestants, and they're religious. They're pretty religious, and so it is pretty common in these years. I'm saying all the way up to the 1890s to argue that Protestantism has and Anglo-American Protestantism is responsible for the women of the United States having the most elevated position in the world, often contrasted with all of those horrible old world countries where Catholic and Jewish and Muslim countries where women are so held in subordination. And Stanton would have none of it. She felt that Protestant Christianity was every bit as responsible for notions about women's subordination as other religions. So when she talked about religion, she meant all religions. She wasn't an irreligious person, but she's really talking about organized religion. And the final book that she put together, she didn't quite write it, she sort of cut and pasted it, was something she called the Woman's Bible. She found it very difficult to find other people to help her with it, but she was determined to basically prepare a revised Bible, one that had the worst parts about women removed. She really wanted to censor the Bible. So what she did was she put out what's usually called a concordance, and it was a book, you can still get it, in which various commentators, women commentators, had things to say about parts of the Bible that were, like, for instance, the two different stories in Genesis. Why are there two different stories? One where men and women are formed equal, and the other where woman is a rib of man. And she addresses that issue.
Wow. Well, now I want to read more about Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Do it. Start with, I didn't just write Suffrage, this book Suffrage that you already, and now you're going to hold it up again, that I wrote. At the same time, my publisher was kind enough to reissue a new copy of Stanton's wonderful autobiography called 80 Years and More, and I wrote an introduction to it. And when we're in college and we read Ben Franklin or Frederick Douglass or Henry Adams, or even Jane Addams, the great American autobiographies, but 80 Years and More is one of the great American autobiographies. So if you want to know more about her and you want to get a sense of how she sort of, she still has meaning today, start there.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, it looks like, and I want to get to one that was asked just a moment ago. Please talk about the role of class in supporting the activist. Where did the rich woman largely stand?
Very good question. We have so much attention these days to race that we do not pay very much attention to class, which was in the last 2 decades of the suffrage movement, both important and a great breakthrough. The 19th century movement we could reasonably call a middle class movement. Then in the late 19th and early 20th century, as the country itself is booming economically, and there are now super rich people and also an enormous, primarily immigrant industrial labor force. Both of those extremes, the millionaires, billionaires, and wage-earning women, white wage-earning women, industrial workers, come together in the suffrage movement. They come together, they collaborate, a little uneasily, but they collaborate. The rich women provide the money for offices and salaries and parades. And the working class women, the tens of thousands of working class women, provide the masses, especially for those parades. So when we look at those parades, we see them carrying the signs of their unions and of their trades. In the last decade of the suffrage movement, there is a coalition between very wealthy and very working class white women who bring the suffrage movement to its conclusion.
All right, well, thank you. And Ellen Carol DuBois, thank you for your time this evening. You all can get Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, the link Kate provided at Acapella Books. You can read it as you are preparing to exercise your vote in November. Thank you so much.
Listen to it. You can listen to it. It's an audio book.
It's on Audible. I may have
all possible ways.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You've been very busy. And thank you all for attending this evening.
Thank you, Atlanta.
Bye-bye.